So, building on our previous discussion of the theoretical framework and classification principles, let's now delve into the actual machinery. We need to lay out the essential anatomical and physiological facts. Think of them as the bricks and mortar that we'll use to build our model of the nervous system as a classification instrument. Now, don't worry about getting lost in every single detail of CNS structure or function. We're aiming for the big picture here. The goal isn't necessarily to nail down every last physiological nuance, but rather to demonstrate how a theory of this kind could potentially explain those fascinating mental events we're interested in. So, let's get started with the inventory. First up, the fundamental building blocks. Almost everyone agrees the nervous system, like the rest of us, is made up of cells, specifically neurons. Think of them as the specialized workers. Each has a body, the cell body, and two main types of extensions, the axon which sends signals out, and dendrites which receive signals from others. Now, there's been some recent chatter questioning the strict neuron doctrine, proposing maybe it's more continuous fiber stuff. But honestly, for our purposes, sticking with the neuron model is fine. Even if that alternative view turns out to be true, it wouldn't really shake the core conclusions we're heading towards. So, neurons it is. Okay, so where do these neurons connect? Think of the cerebral cortex as the ultimate traffic hub, the most complex bridge connecting incoming sensory information afferent fibers coming from receptors out there in the world, with outgoing motor commands efferent fibers going to muscles and glands. This suggests the whole CNS, including the cortex itself, operates like a hierarchy. Imagine multiple layers, like floors in a building, with connections crisscrossing between them. Information flows generally from lower sensory levels up through these levels, and then down to motor outputs. But hold on, this isn't like a neat stack of floors. These levels aren't always clearly separated physically or functionally. It's more like a tangled web of overlapping pathways, not a simple ladder. Now here's a mind-boggling number crunch. Inside these central processing hubs, the number of individual neurons is massively larger than the number of input and output channels. We're talking orders of magnitude. Take the cortex again. Estimates suggest around 10 billion neurons packed in there. But how many distinct fibers carrying signals directly into or out of the cortex? Maybe just a few million. It's like having a city full of people, but only a handful of roads leading in and out. And it gets even more extreme at the periphery. The number of different types of sensory receptors out there is vastly greater than the number of different fiber types carrying their signals into the brain. This sheer numerical disparity is crucial. So what kind of message does each fiber carry? Here's a key point. While our skin receptors might be sensitive to pressure and eye receptors to light, the electrical impulse zipping along the nerve fiber itself is pretty uniform. Think of it like sending a standard postcard. The postcard itself doesn't say whether it's a photo of a cat or a dog. That information is encoded elsewhere. There's no known direct link between the specific attributes of the original stimulus, like its color, loudness, texture, and the intrinsic properties of the nerve impulse traveling to the brain. The raw signal is basically the same, regardless of what caused it. How does this uniform impulse travel? Not like a smooth river current, but more like a series of discrete sparks or bursts. You get a quick succession of discharges down the fiber. And usually these signals have a one-way street. They travel down the axon towards the target neuron. However, the fiber itself probably has the physical capability to send signals both ways. What determines the direction? Likely its position relative to the neuron's cell body and its place in the chain of command. It's like a pipe that can carry water either way, but the plumbing setup dictates which direction the water actually flows. This leads us to a classic principle, all or none. For any given neuron and any given stimulus above a threshold, the neuron either fires an impulse or it doesn't. If it fires, the impulse is always the same size, the same strength. It's like a light switch, either it's on full brightness or off completely. There's no dimming. This means transmission isn't really about passing energy along like a bucket brigade. Instead, firing one neuron releases stored energy in the next neuron, triggering its own potential fire. It's a relay race where the baton either gets passed or it doesn't. Okay, so individual impulses are all the same intensity. But how do we represent different levels of stimulation, like a soft whisper versus a shout? Well, the intrinsic power of the impulse varies. Thicker axons, for instance, tend to carry stronger signals. Also, while a single spark on a fiber is fixed, the duration of the signal matters. A fiber might fire just once, or it might fire rapidly in a burst. This longer burst, this train of impulses, can have a cumulative effect, sometimes acting like a higher intensity signal. It's like tapping someone gently once versus tapping them repeatedly fast. The repeated taps can add up to a stronger sensation. So far, we've mostly talked about signals that excite, that turn neurons on. But there's another type of signal: inhibition. Some nerve fibers seem to carry messages that dampen things down, that suppress or quiet other neurons. Think of it as a brake pedal for neural activity. While excitation is like hitting the gas, inhibition is like stepping on the brakes. This ability to both excite and inhibit is fundamental for controlling neural circuits. Where do these signals hand off? At synapses. These are the junction points where one neuron communicates with another. Now, here's a revolutionary idea. These connections aren't hardwired forever. They can change. They can be formed, strengthened, weakened, even eliminated during the organism's life. How? Probably when neurons fire together repeatedly, the famous Hebbian idea. Cells that fire together, wire together. But honestly, we're still in the dark about the exact mechanics. Is it a physical bridge being built, or just a stronger chemical handshake? And what about inhibitory connections? We have less clue how those specific inhibitory links get established. It's a frontier of neuroscience. If we accept that simultaneous firing strengthens connections, what happens next? If neuron A regularly fires and causes neuron B to fire, and they fire together often, wouldn't it make sense that B also starts to influence A? This suggests that these learned connections are often reciprocal. If A talks to B, B probably starts talking back too. Whether they use the same pathway or different ones isn't specified here, but the idea is that mutual influence develops. It's like building a two-way conversation channel whenever two parties talk frequently enough. Remember the all or none rule. It sounds absolute, but there's a clever workaround: summation. Because a single impulse might be too weak to trigger the next neuron, the system uses teamwork. Spatial summation. If several weak impulses arrive at the same neuron from different sources almost simultaneously, their combined effect can push the neuron over the threshold. Temporal summation. Similarly, if a single neuron fires rapidly in quick succession, the repeated hits can accumulate enough force to trigger the downstream neuron, even if a single hit wouldn't. It's like needing multiple people to pull a rope at once, or pulling it very quickly to get something moving. Think about perceiving something complex, like recognizing a face. Does just one specific receptor firing create the experience of seeing a face? Unlikely. It seems we often need input from multiple receptors, sometimes even different types of receptors, like both eyes and ears for judging distance or direction. This means the initial signal reaching the brain isn't just one impulse, but a pattern of impulses arriving via several different pathways. The richness of our perception likely comes from integrating these multi-channel inputs. All right, we've listed the key facts. But to understand how this system works as a classifier, we need to simplify. Some details, especially the precise timing of everything, are incredibly important, but would bog down our explanation right now. Given what we know, trying to map every millisecond would be premature. So, we'll make some deliberate simplifying assumptions. Think of it like sketching the outline of a complex machine before adding all the tiny gears and springs. We start simple to grasp the core principles. So, what are these simplifications? First, we'll pretend to look at what happens when just one lonely sensory impulse arrives. Forget the fact that usually dozens or hundreds arrive together. Second, we're going to ignore the motor system entirely for now. Let's just focus on how sensory signals talk to each other within the sensory realm. Third, we'll pretend the brain's hierarchical structure doesn't exist. Imagine all these connections forming in one big flat network. These are drastic simplifications, ignoring huge chunks of reality like the sensory-motor loop and the layered organization. But they help isolate the basic classification mechanism. Now, why these drastic cuts? We know ignoring the motor system and the hierarchy is skipping major pieces. But the author argues this is a deliberate strategy, inspired by older neurophysiological ideas, emphasizing the internal organization of the sensory system itself, separate from immediate action. The idea is to first understand the ordering principles within the sensory world before bringing in motor responses. When we talk about effects here, we mean effects on other central processes, like evoking other impulses or activating neurons that act like symbols for certain classes of inputs. We also gloss over whether connections are innate or learned, assuming a blank slate starts forming connections. And we include both strong direct links and weaker potential links that need backup. It's a simplified sandbox model. Okay, with our simplified setup, how does classification start? Consider the simplest case, identity. Imagine two neurons, A and B. If A is connected to exactly the same set of other neurons as B, then whenever A fires, it triggers the exact same sequence of events downstream. Same goes for B. Their positions in the network are identical, so their functional meaning is identical. If you stimulate A, you get outcome X. Stimulate B, you get outcome X. They are classified into the same category because they produce the same results. Now flip the coin. What if neuron A has absolutely no connections in common with neuron B? Then stimulating A produces a totally different set of outcomes compared to stimulating B. They belong to entirely different classes. But reality, as usual, lies somewhere in between. You'll find groups of neurons that share some connections, but not all. Maybe A shares 50% of its connections with B, but only 10% with C. This gives us degrees of similarity. Neurons aren't either identical or completely different. They exist on a spectrum of shared connectivity. Here's a subtle but important point about similarity. Imagine neuron A shares 5 connections with neuron B, and also shares 5 connections with neuron C. Does that mean B and C must be similar to each other? Not necessarily. Those 5 connections A shares with B could be completely different from the 5 connections A shares with C. So A is similar to B, A is similar to C, but B and C might have nothing in common. This is a classic example of non-transitive similarity. Just because two things are similar to a third thing doesn't mean they're similar to each other. It's like saying apples and oranges are both fruits similar to bananas, but apples and oranges aren't necessarily similar to each other in all respects relevant to fruit classification. So what drives this similarity? Why do some neurons end up with similar connection patterns? The hypothesis here is co-occurrence. If two different types of receptors are often activated together by the same object or event, the neurons representing those receptors will tend to develop similar sets of downstream connections. Think about it. If you see red and hear a siren together whenever there's an emergency vehicle, the neurons processing red light and the ones processing the siren sound will become linked to similar subsequent neural events representing the concept of emergency. This similarity is forged in the crucible of experience, specifically the frequent pairing of stimuli. Let's break down why co-occurrence leads to similarity. First, physically similar stimuli often hit nearby receptors at the same time. Think of light waves of slightly different colors hitting adjacent photoreceptors. Second, different types of stimuli often appear together. Movement and sound often go hand in hand. So, the neurons processing movement and the ones processing sound will get linked because those events frequently coincide. Third, context matters. Maybe certain visual patterns always appear when you're leaning forward, or certain smells always occur when you're hungry. The neurons processing the visual pattern or smell will then get linked to the neurons representing your posture or hunger state. It's all about statistical regularities in the input stream. So, through all these mechanisms, the brain builds a map of the world based on what tends to happen together. Every time a primary impulse arrives, it doesn't just trigger one thing. It triggers a whole cascade, a sequel of secondary impulses that represent the typical companions of the original stimulus. Think of it like this. Seeing a red traffic light doesn't just mean red, it automatically brings up thoughts of stopping, maybe the sound of brakes, the feeling of the brake pedal, etc. That whole package is the sequel of the red light impulse. And it's the identity of this sequel that puts different primary impulses into the same class. If seeing red brings up the same sequel as hearing a specific warning tone, they might be classified similarly. Now things get interesting. Because an impulse has a sequel made of multiple parts, it can belong to many classes at once. Let's say impulse A's sequel includes impulses B, C, and D. Impulse A forms a class with B because they share the link A to B. It also forms a class with C because they share A to C. It might even form a class with the pair B and C because they both follow A. So one single impulse can be a member of multiple overlapping groups, based on different aspects of its sequel. This is multiple classification in the sense that one item fits into several categories simultaneously. This is a really cool twist, highlighting a difference from simple machines. In our model, the things being classified, the primary impulses, are also doing the classifying. How? Through their sequel. When impulse A fires, it evokes its sequel B, C, D. These sequel impulses B, C, D are themselves the classifiers that determine which higher-level classes A belongs to. It's a self-referential loop. This allows the system to build incredibly complex models of relationships between stimuli. It's not just sorting apples and oranges, it's sorting relationships between apples, oranges, and maybe even abstract concepts represented by those impulses. The potential for representing complex structures is immense. Let's revisit that distinction between effective and potential connections. We can apply this to the sequel idea too. Part of an impulse's sequel might consist of effective sequel. These impulses will definitely fire whenever the primary impulse appears. But other parts might be potential sequel. These impulses might fire, but only if they get extra help, reinforcement from other impulses firing at the same time. It's like having a guaranteed response and a conditional one. This adds another layer of nuance to how classification works. Could two different neurons ever become functionally identical? Theoretically, yes. If they ended up with exactly the same sequel, they'd be interchangeable. The author mentions pressure on opposing teeth as a possible example, though he admits he can't verify it. But usually, even very similar sensations feel different because we perceive their location. So, just having a common sequel isn't enough. We also need a way to differentiate between neurons representing, say, pressure on the left tooth versus the right tooth. This suggests we need more than just shared sequel. We need to account for the differences that define spatial location. How might we achieve this spatial differentiation? Let's look at vision. Historically, thinkers like Berkeley proposed that we perceive space because visual signals are linked to the muscle movements needed to track objects. Our approach echoes this, but with a twist. We don't assume the muscle tension itself creates a sensation of space. Instead, we propose that the brain forms connections between visual impulses and the impulses representing the intended or actual eye movements. Crucially, these movement impulses could arise even without actual movement, just through association. The key takeaway here is that complex sensations like spatial perception often rely on the interplay between sensory input and the body's state or posture. As we explore this, the lines blur between purely sensory processing and motor control. Think about perception itself. It's rarely passive. We orient our heads, move our eyes, maybe even take a step. These are motor responses happening alongside sensing, and these movements generate feedback. Kinesthetic feelings, proprioceptive signals about body position. These signals arising from the motor act triggered by the initial sensation become part of the sequel of that original sensory impulse. It's a feedback loop. We'll dig deeper into this sensorimotor integration later, but it's already clear it's deeply intertwined with classification. The sheer variety of possible sequel differences is staggering. From near identical to completely unrelated, each variation potentially means something functionally unique. And remember, inhibition, that adds another dimension. Inhibitory connections allow for opposition. Imagine impulse A normally leads to sequel B, C, D. But if impulse X also fires, it might inhibit the pathway to C, preventing it from firing. So the presence of X changes the sequel of A. This allows for not just similarity gradients, but also for direct opposition, for canceling out expected effects. The system becomes incredibly flexible. So, what's the point of all these different sequels? Their significance lies in the different effects they produce. When a new impulse arrives, it modifies the ongoing activity of the entire system based on its own sequel, and how that interacts with everything else happening at that moment. The future path depends on this dynamic interplay. It's less like a static blueprint, and more like a constantly evolving conversation. While we can describe the potential connections statically, the real action is the dynamic process of impulses triggering other impulses, constantly reshaping the system's state. Can we classify not just individual impulses, but the relationships between classes? Yes, the same learning mechanism applies. If impulses X and Y often fire together in the sequel of A and B, then X and Y will start to form connections between themselves. Furthermore, even if impulses A and B never fire together, if they both happen to connect to a common third impulse Z, they might end up in the same derived sequel through Z. This allows the system to build classifications about the co-occurrence of different classes of events. This is particularly important for those neurons deep in the cortex that don't directly touch a receptor. They act as intermediaries. They only get activated if they're part of someone else's sequel. Once they fire, they acquire their own sequel, becoming symbols representing the classes of impulses that led to them. And these symbolic neurons can then participate in forming even higher-level classes, whose members are these symbols themselves. It's like building abstractions upon abstractions. You classify individual letters, then words made of letters, then sentences made of words, and so on. Multiple levels of classification emerge naturally. So we have multiple ways this classification gets complex. First, one impulse can be in many classes simultaneously. Second, whole groups of impulses can be treated as single units if they consistently co-occur and trigger the same sequel together. Third, classes themselves can be grouped into metaclasses based on similarities in their own representative sequel. These three types of multiple classification work together, creating an almost infinite capacity for the system to distinguish between different patterns of activity. The word classification feels a bit limited here. It implies crisp categories in or out, but the system seems capable of much more. It can make distinctions of degree. How strongly does an impulse belong to a class? This depends on whether the connections are strong and direct or weak and potential. Sometimes an impulse might only belong to a class if it gets extra support. This suggests evaluation might be a better term. It captures the idea that the system isn't just sorting things into boxes, but assessing their properties and relationships with varying degrees of certainty or strength. Let's focus on that second type of multiple classification, treating groups as single units. Here, the entire group must fire to evoke its specific sequel. Think of it like needing the whole chord, not just one note, to trigger a particular musical response downstream. This allows for classifications based on the collective behavior of a set of impulses. And again, the strength of this group response could depend on how many members of the required group actually fire. How do these group sequels form? The impulses in the sequel must be connected via potential links to the individual members of the primary group. The simplest case, several primary impulses, say P1, P2, P3, all have potential links to a secondary impulse S. S will only fire reliably if P1, P2, and P3 fire together. Now imagine another group Q1, Q2, Q3 also connects to S. Both groups P1, P2, P3, and Q1, 2, 3 are now classified into the same class of groups because they both activate S. And this symbolic impulse S can then go on to form part of a higher level class, classifying classes of groups. Now we get to the really powerful part, classifying the relations between classes. How? By looking at the positions of the impulses representing those classes within the overall system. Suppose pairing members of class A with members of class B always triggers the same specific response R, and pairing members of class E with members of class F also triggers response R. but pairing A with E or B with F triggers a different response S. In this case, we can classify the relation between A and B as being different from the relation between E and F simply because they evoke the same downstream classifier R. We're classifying the relationship itself based on the shared outcome. These impulses that represent relations between other impulses don't just sit there. They themselves acquire sequels, giving them their own unique functional role. The qualities represented by their sequel would then be assigned to the relation itself. Alternatively, you can think of it as different types of relations between, say, shapes and colors, becoming distinct entities that can then trigger further processing. Relations themselves become classified items. And here's the kicker. These relations can themselves be ordered and classified using the exact same principles we started with. The causal connection, the basic building block, becomes the tool to build increasingly complex structures involving different kinds of relations. We can classify not just individual impulses but groups, relations between impulses, relations between relations, and so on. It's a recursive process, allowing the system to build arbitrarily complex hierarchies of meaning and structure. The potential complexity here is mind-boggling. With billions of neurons and trillions of possible connections, the number of possible differences and relationships is practically limitless. The real constraint isn't the system's capacity, it's our own ability to comprehend the sheer scale of the order it can generate. The author even speculates that any conceivable structure of relationships could, in principle, be mirrored within such a system. It's a breathtaking claim about the representational power of this neural architecture. What about the difference between the significance of a single impulse versus the significance of a group it belongs to? The author argues this is conceptually similar. Both arise from the same underlying principle of connection-based classification. While we might focus on group significance sometimes, the individual's contribution to the group's meaning is equally valid. They feed into each other. An impulse's individual meaning contributes to the group's significance, and the group's significance reinforces the impulse's role within that context. Neither is fundamentally primary. They co-define each other within the larger system. This framework elegantly handles a classic problem. How do we perceive abstract things like melodies or concepts, not just basic sensations? Traditionally, this was seen as a major hurdle for purely psychological explanations. But here, it's no problem. The problem of why different combinations of notes sound like the same melody is fundamentally the same as why different light frequencies look like the same color. Both are solved by the same principle. Identical mental attributes correspond to identical physiological patterns of impulses and their sequels. Learning transfer and generalization also fall out naturally from this, because the same underlying impulse pattern represents the same attribute, whether it's encountered directly or indirectly. This connects beautifully to Gestalt psychology. The core insight that we perceive wholes whose properties differ from the sum of their parts is explained here. Why do we see a triangle when looking at three lines, even if the lines are presented sequentially? Because the impulses representing the lines, when combined, activate a downstream pattern that's similar to the pattern activated by the lines, forming a real triangle. This theory provides a causal mechanism for field organization. It's not magic, but the result of interconnected impulses. The organization isn't something extra added onto sensations. It is the structure that defines the sensations themselves. The idea extends beyond just Gestalt figures. We can broaden the concept of an organized field to include relationships across different senses, like sight and sound. This leads to a blurring of the line between sensation and perception. Both are essentially the same process, just operating at different levels of abstraction within the same classification hierarchy. So we can use the term perception more broadly, covering everything from basic color detection to recognizing a melody. And crucially, this same principle applies upwards. Abstract concepts, like justice or freedom, can be understood as high-level classes or classes of classes, built upon the same fundamental mechanism. Interestingly, Perceiving an abstract feature might happen somewhat independently of consciously perceiving the concrete details it supposedly represents. So we've explored this intricate system of classification within the CNS. But earlier we made a big simplification. We focused only on sensory-to-sensory connections. Why? To highlight the internal processing, countering the behaviorist focus solely on observable actions. However, a purely passive registration device, however sophisticated, doesn't capture the whole story. It doesn't explain why certain stimuli are meaningful for a living organism in its specific environment. Now, we need to bring back that missing piece, the connection between sensation and behavior, acknowledging the crucial role of the motor system and the organism's goals and actions. That's where we're headed next.